The Bear Roars special edition series, Bandwidth, serves as a platform to celebrate the people and stories of Dan's book. Bandwidth, the untold story of ambition, deception, and innovation that shaped the internet age and the dot-com boom. The story covers the epic journey of the creation of the internet's backbone, the building of the early competitive fiber networks in the 1990s, the bandwidth boom, bust, and resurrection ending in 2020 when Dan's company Zayo was sold. The book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Head to dan-caruso.com/book for more details. In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan Caruso sits down with Dave Schaeffer, CEO of Cogent Communications, for part 2 of their conversation, an inside look at how one of telecom's most resilient companies was built from the ashes of the dot-com collapse. Dave unpacks Cogent's bold, disciplined playbook, how he turned a half-built network into a global powerhouse through a series of high-stakes acquisitions, from PSI Net to LambdaNet and beyond. He shares what it took to navigate bankruptcy courts, win distressed auctions, and stay laser-focused on return on invested capital when the rest of the industry was burning cash. It's a masterclass in opportunistic entrepreneurship, financial discipline, and conviction through chaos, told by one of the most strategic deal-makers in digital infrastructure. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
So, Dave Schaeffer, do you know what my number one viewed podcast is?
I have no idea, Dan.
It's you.
Oh, I'm in trouble then.
Which you surpassed Kevin O'Hara, who was in the number one spot for a long time. But you do have a few people rapidly on your heels. But I would have not guessed that you and Kevin would be 1 and 2. And really the bandwidth related ones dominate the top 10. There's maybe 2 or 3 that aren't bandwidth related that are in the top 10, but the rest of them are all the big bandwidth guests. I recently dropped John Siegel just in the last couple of weeks or so. My guess is give John Siegel's podcast some time and he'll start coming up there and nipping at your guys' heels before too long. But congratulations.
I'll just be old news. I'll be yesterday's 15 minutes of fame.
I don't know. I mean, we'll share with you offline the number of views we're seeing of yours, and it's pretty remarkable. And it was that way, pretty much since we dropped it. It rose up and kind of got up in the ranks, and then it kept rising. So you've got a lot of people interested in your story. And I also had several people reach out to me who would hear your podcast and they would send me a note out of the blue and say, oh my gosh, someone told me to listen to the Dave Schaeffer podcast. So I did, and it was so good. I mean, your story about, your early years and who you were and what you did and how you got to where you were admired by a lot of people who've been listening to this podcast. But because we took so much time to go through those early years, we didn't get much into the heart of the story that we all know you for, which is the origin story of Cogent and how creative and thoughtful you were in the depths of the telecom meltdown .bomb to do a lot of very clever deals and create what became Cogent. And that's why we wanted to get back on and do part 2 is to go into those stories. So
absolutely, Dan. So let's jump in and see if I can answer some of those questions. And thanks for those kind words.
Absolutely. So let's get right in there. We'll cover a little bit of ground from last time as to the origin itself of Cogent. Let's start right at the launch of Cogent. Again, a little bit of ground we covered last time, but let's recover that ground on how Cogent was launched, the initial funding for it, and the initial idea, and then we'll quickly get to where the telecom bust happened and what you had to do to navigate from there. And I really want to get into each of the deals you did and kind of the play-by-play on each of the fundamental deals, that transactions you pulled off in order to create Cogent.
Well, so at the beginning of Cogent, we never contemplated doing deals. We thought we would organically build the business. And the idea behind Cogent was the internet would be the only network that would matter in the long run. 2, bandwidth is a commodity. and you had to be the lowest cost producer. 3, local access is a natural monopoly. So you had to be ultra selective in picking your endpoints to get an adequate return on invested capital. 4, you had to have a compelling value proposition that would lower your cost of revenue acquisition below that of others. And then 5th, and maybe most importantly, you needed to have an architecture that could capture the economic value of advances in technology more effectively than other networks and convert that into economic rent, part of it being profit, part of it being the ability to drive down pricing for your customers. And
If I could jump in for a second there, and I want to focus on 3 and 4 and then into 5, which you started getting a little more detail. So let's start with your third value prop, which is, if I'm getting the order right, which is pick the locations really thoughtfully. And the context in which I want you to talk about that a little bit more is most of our big rivals have so much trouble doing that. If they don't have a generic pricing structure that applies to, you know, almost like a huge superset of, customers and geographies. If they don't do that, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to productize it. They don't know how to give it to an operations organization. They don't know how to create a pricing strategy. But you brought up a really good point, which I 100% agree with, which is part of the art of, if you want to make money in this business, is realizing how important that not just last mile is, but that last 1,000 feet is. How you can get the service all the way to the customer. So what did you see there, and what was your solution at the time to be really choosy where you're going to solve that problem, so that the economic rents that you get to later were available to you to enjoy?
yeah, so we decided to focus on 2 decoupled addressable markets. The first of those were end users in North America that were located in the central business districts of major North American cities in large multi tenant office buildings. So if you look at the total universe of commercial buildings in North America, there are nearly 5 million buildings, but approximately 3.8 million of those are single tenant. There are a lot of gas stations and car washes or single tenant office buildings. That brought us down to a universe of about 1.1 million pure office buildings. Of those, another 300,000 were really either vacant or single tenant offices as opposed to single tenant factories or warehouses. So that left an addressable market of approximately 800,000 buildings with approximately 9 billion square feet of office space. It was not practical to serve that entire office footprint. So we rank ordered the buildings based on size, number of tenants, and close proximity to adjacent buildings that we could serve. We identified initially 800 buildings that were eventually expanded to the 1,870 end user buildings we're in today. Those buildings average 41 stories in height, 553,000 square feet, and have an average of 51 discrete businesses or tenants. Compare that to the average of the remaining multi tenant office buildings that average 19,000 square feet with 2.3 tenants. So it was definitely a cream skimming model
And let
on
me
corporate.
yeah. So let me pause you there. I know we're going to talk about the other segment as well, but for the people listening to this, I want to emphasize a few points. One is, when they hear you say this, it sounds very logical, and it is very thoughtful, and it is. what most people listening to this don't realize is when you try to do that in our industry, most people who've been in our industry tell you you shouldn't and can't be successful doing that because, if they're coming from a sales perspective, they don't like being constrained to you could only sell in these locations. They want to sell everywhere. So they want to have a relationship with the customer that's strong, and then they want to tell a customer, yes, we could provide, lots of service types to you to all kinds of different locations. So you get huge resistance from people who are traditional sales, in their line of thinking in our industry. Then from a technical standpoint, the operations people are like, whoa, time out here. I just need kind of one generic model that I can apply everywhere. I don't like this idea that, I might have to understand each building in its own merits. So they want to resist you. And then there's this kind of the broader notion of the investor universe who says, boy, if you don't describe your addressable market in a much bigger way, to address a whole bunch more locations and buildings and cities, then we aren't going to put a value on you because we're going to perceive you as kind of constrained. So what you did is more unorthodox than it might come off to be to the average listener. But at the same time, and by the way, I didn't steal those exact ideas, but uh, I definitely was of that frame of mind that you got to be really specific in what you're trying to do. And it's not down to the city or, the part of the city you're serving or even the building itself. It's what are you trying to serve within a building? That's your, no pun intended, building block. And you got to understand that from a customer location and work backwards. And you got to be finding those sweet spots where it's the right number of customer locations with a nice set of the right kind of customers. You're looking for those needles in a haystack, and then you got to be all over them. And it was hard to convince people, to think of the business that way.
Well, I think sometimes the best deals you make are the deals you don't make. And the hardest thing you have to do if you've got venture backers is keep them focused. They want to do the next new thing. They want to sell the next shiny object. And you're right, they want the total addressable market to be as big as possible, but they ignore the return on invested capital. We effectively cheated on the end user business two ways: by being hyper focused on the buildings we would select, and then two, buying dark fiber from people like Zayo and others to get to as close to the building as possible, building as little outside plant as we could, and then we would pre-wire the building with a vertical riser with breakout boxes on every third floor. So when you turned up a customer, your horizontal was never more than one floor up or one floor down. And it kept your installation cost at about $600 per sub. It was all about trying to come up with a cost effective way to get revenue on net. And you sell only the product that's in structural ascendancy, and you ignore all of the products that are in structural decline. And the internet fit that bill. So we built a network solely focused on the internet. And then the second addressable market was a global market where
Can,
we
can I
focused on data centers.
can I pause you again before we go to the second one?
Absolutely.
Again, to help just emphasize the points that you're making. What you said there had to do with a very narrow product strategy. Now, that again sounds very logical to a casual listener, but most people in the industry, that was just something they would not accept. We have to, how can we go to a customer and sell them one thing that they need when they have multiple things they need? How are we going to sell them internet when we're not willing to sell them voice? How can we sell them internet if we're not willing to serve lots of locations with internet? And you had to devise a strategy that said, I think we can sell a location at a time, so I don't have, they might have 30 locations all over the place, but if I could just serve 2 or 3 of them, I think we could, as long as my product is better than other products and my pricing is better than other products, they're still going to buy that product from me. And then if they want to go buy voice from someone else, I don't care. I don't want to clog up our system with products that are going to be in decline and are much more complicated. And you were able to pull that off, but most of your rivals wouldn't even, go there. They just thought it was such a unclever thing to do.
Yeah, well, focus is really important. One of the challenges, and you know this, Dan, in starting a company from scratch is you have a clean sheet of paper and you can do whatever you want. And it's very easy to get distracted and pulled in many directions, quickly losing your focus. And, if you look at any business and any industry, I think in valuing that business comes down to really three basic questions. Do people need what you're selling? Two, why will they buy it from you versus someone else? And then three, can you make money at it when they buy it?
Yep.
And, in defining what we were good at, we knew eventually every business would need the internet. By the way, in 99, that was not conventional wisdom.
No,
Everybody thought the internet was good for a couple of emails and some blogs, but it really was never going to be able to support mission critical applications. I believe that because the internet was the most interconnected, most application agnostic, and most ubiquitous because it sat on other networks, it would eventually replace all of those other purpose built application specific networks.
Mhm.
That turned out to be correct. Two, I knew by building an IP over DWDM network protected at layer 3 using Ethernet, I would replicate a corporate LAN on a global footprint and have the absolute lowest cost per routed bit mile. And if you think about it, what we were doing is deploying enterprise class equipment on a carrier scale, whereas everybody else was trying to sell the internet as an overlay on top of a telephone or cable network that is inherently 1 to 2 orders of magnitude more expensive per bit mile. So we had a lower underlying cost and we had a more resilient architecture. So if you look at a cable network, say branch and tree network with an infinite number of potential failure points. A telco network is a hub and spoke network where each home run to the central office is unprotected and potential failure point. We built a series of rings so every location had dual physical pathing, and then we used OSPF to protect the network at the edge, and we used ISIS to protect at the core using layer 3 convergence. Now, as technology advanced, we were able to eventually replace that with IP fast reroute. But at the time, that technology didn't really exist. And one of the big limitations was the actual cost of a router was too expensive to put in a building. So the original design was to always use a pure routed network, but instead we had to use switches which had much less memory and then run them in a layer 3 configuration. So tricking them into being routers, but they couldn't carry a full table. So we had to have a 2-tier architecture where at the edge, we were running only a local table and then translating that into the full routing table at each of our market hubs where we put traffic onto a real router. Now, as the price of routing fell, we were eventually able to put true layer 3 routers in every building.
Yeah. I will say this, every one of your rivals had a big advantage over you in the years 1999 to the years 2002, and that is they didn't give a shit about return on invested capital. So they weren't worried about the true concept of value creation, meaning if you invest X dollars, you better get a lot more than X dollars back, not on hopes that someone puts some crazy valuation on you, but just based on the math of how much revenue you collect, how much that revenue do you get to keep in the form of kind of operating cash flow, and how does that compare with the capital that you spent to do that? You were, and I'll say we were too in the Zayo context. That was like a fundamental first order principle for you and for us. But most people in our industry, they either didn't understand it and still to this date have trouble understanding, or at the time of 1999 to 2002, that was the last thing they cared about. They just wanted to get their hands on more capital, spend it as quickly as possible, and tell a good story about why their company's worth a lot more than the capital they spent. But you were really concerned about the microeconomics, and that if it works at the microeconomic level, it'll work at the macroeconomic level. And others just didn't, they weren't doing that.
Well, and in fact, when I founded PathNet, the model was for every dollar of PP&E you put in the ground, you got $4.50 of enterprise value, independent of whether that capital was productive or not.
Yeah.
Where you were incented to borrow as much and to build as much, and were less concerned about an ROIC. And I took that experience and translated it over and said at Cogent, we have to be hyper focused on getting a optimal
Yeah.
ROIC for each dollar of incremental capital.
Yeah. You were focused on the truth, not a story. Okay, so let's move forward a bit. Let's talk maybe very briefly about the other market segment, because that's important. But I really want to get straight into the deals that you did once it was clear the bubble had burst. And now there were these very interesting assets out there that you get for pennies on the dollar, and how you were able to kind of get one deal done, then the next deal. So each one has its own story. It's those stories I really want to get into.
Yeah. So our second addressable market, which accounts for 40% of classic Cogent's revenue, but 97% of its traffic, was selling bulk transit or wholesale bandwidth in data centers globally. And we ultimately connected to just under 1,900 data centers in 57 countries around the world. And we sell a meter service at a lower price per megabit and are now the largest carrier of internet traffic in the world, carrying about 1.8 exabytes a day of traffic across our network, representing just over 25% of global internet traffic rides on the Cogent network every day. We are the most interconnected. We have more autonomous systems directly connected to us. We are in more data centers with more capacity. And the better you're connected, the better your service runs, because there are less intermediate autonomous systems between sender and receiver. And in fact, it's 73% of the instances we're actually getting paid on a double-sided model, meaning we're getting paid by the sender and the receiver. We make that transparent to the customer, and it's part of why we can price the way we do. But you want to talk deals now, Dan?
Yes, I want to talk deals. So tell
Let's
us about the deals that you first. So first, in lead up to that, the bubble burst. So the telecom meltdown was underway. You have a lot of cash at the time, correct? You had just kind of really put the balance sheet together, and now you're facing a situation where, oh my gosh, the telecom world is being turned upside down. Is that right?
So the original Cogent business plan called for us to raise $2 billion to build this global network by buying IRUs and then deploying the equipment that I described.
Yep.
And we had raised 500 million, and it was clear there was no more capital available. So in April of '01, I called an investor meeting. It was
It was
actually
clear because of the crash. The crash was starting to happen.
absolutely
Yeah.
so we actually signed our term sheet in October of 99. We funded the first week in February, and the second week in March, the dot-com crash happened, and then the second week in September of 2000, the telecom bubble burst. And, first it appeared temporary, but over the next 6 or 7 months, it became clear that this was a permanent sea change in the market. So in April of '01, I called an investor meeting, which were all 10 of my investors, and I laid out 3 paths forward. The first path was liquidation, just use the cash, liquidate, and divvy up the cash. Because I had preferences and liquidation rights, it would have been a windfall for me and a loss for my investors, which was unacceptable for a non-operational company.
Could you have done that, or you needed their approval to do that?
Well, I would have needed the approval,
Yep.
but the approval would have been granted under duress
Sure.
because the alternative was for those investors to agree to put the next 1.5 billion in because a half-built network is worthless. You
Mhm.
can't complete the path of the bit travel, and therefore you have nothing to sell. So no one had the appetite to put more capital in, and we ultimately chose a third path. It was a very vigorous debate that lasted over 3 hours, and I in turn agreed to reduce my equity stake by almost 95%. I went from 23% to 0.7%, cramming myself down in exchange for getting the capital to be used as a blind pool to buy distress assets. And the idea was not to do a roll up, not to buy operating companies, but to buy assets that we could repurpose into the Cogent business model. And we ultimately looked at 121 targets. We bid on 19 and were successful in winning 13 of the 19 we bid on. We then typically would fire the customers, we would fire the employees, we would turn the business dark, we would dismantle it and take a subset of the equipment, redeploy it in Cogent's architecture, and then sell off the surplus equipment that was irrelevant to our model. So things like ATM switches or frame switches, things like DAXs that just had no purpose in our architecture got sold into the market. And at the time, we were completely homogeneous with only Cisco equipment end to end. So if we acquired Nortel or Juniper or Siemens or Avicii, we actually sold that gear off to maintain the network purity that gave us a lower cost of operation with a very standardized architecture. And the first deal we did was we acquired NetRail out of bankruptcy. And NetRail was an Atlanta based ISP that was one of the original 7 tier 1 providers that had raised capital, had attempted to go public but failed, and effectively was bankrupt. And it was in a very distressed situation. There was an auction, and we were successful in winning those assets. Uh, and we then repurposed.
So when you were successful winning the assets, so describe the auction if if it's you have the memory of the auction itself. Uh, what you did to win the auction, how much you end up paying for those assets, and put that in perspective in terms of how much had been invested in those assets, prior to the auction process.
So we spent about $9 million in that auction. It was actually an open bankruptcy auction, 363 reorg in Atlanta. And we were bidding against a Goldman Sachs back. So it was Goldman Sachs Asset Management uh, partners backing the former CEO of Sprint International, Paulo Guidi, in a pledge deal, and he had bid up to $8.5 million, and we ultimately prevailed in that auction at 9 million, acquiring the NetRail network, its interconnection agreements, its customer agreements, and its hardware, all free of debt. And probably one of the big challenges in that acquisition, actually getting a clean audit opinion for the actual business that we bought. Because if you wanted to go public eventually, you needed to have 3 years of audited financials for any acquisition. And because this company was in distress, had not paid their auditor, BDO refused to sign an audit opinion. And we ended up getting a regional firm in Atlanta, Habib Ganian and Wynn, to conduct the audit.
How come
And
that doesn't sound legitimate?
it provided the actual audit opinion. That was a necessary condition to close the deal. Uh, the next deal
Oh, but wait,
we
one more question there. Did you get fiber assets with that as well, or this is more about the interconnects and
this was really the peering agreements, the routers, and some critical data center space. There
gotcha,
was no fiber in that
gotcha.
initial deal.
Hmm.
The second deal we did, we actually failed the first time, and we ended up buying it on the third attempt. And I'll get to those in order. So the second deal that we did was a company called Aegis. Phil Lawler was the CEO. It had originally started life as Net 99. It was also one of the 7 original internet companies that appeared to create the first commercial internet. And Phil had the dubious moniker of being known as the king of spam. He was not the most stable person in the world. The board ended up bringing in a fellow named Al Adams to be the chief restructuring officer in bankruptcy. It was a bankruptcy in Detroit, another open hearing. There was a much bigger network than NetRail, more equipment, more customer contracts. We bid up to $30,500,000. Our bidder against us was Telia, the Swedish
Yep.
incumbent. And Magnus Schell, who was the CEO of Telia International, flew in from Sweden, was there at the bidding, and at a break, called me out in the hall. We had a discussion, and he basically said, "I'm willing to go further." And I said, "I'm not. I'm going to walk back in and no bid on the next round and let Telia win the assets of Aegis." And we moved on. The third acquisition we did was Allied Rise.
Yep.
Allied was a public company. Uh, it actually had been backed by some of the VCs that like Centennial, were
Yes.
involved in
Do
their
you remember who else was involved? Centennial, who else?
Uh, don't remember.
That's right. Yeah, just
They
curious.
they were the lead.
Okay.
Uh, MCI put some money in. Sam Zell was the chairman of the company,
Oh wow.
and he had put money in through equity office. Uh, and the idea was they were going to build in building networks in order to provide a full suite of services and then buy out of building connectivity. And I remember when I was first raising money for the Cogent business plan, a PE shop went into his drawer of his desk, pulled out an Allied Riser report by Goldman and said, Dave, you're too late. Somebody's already done what you're doing. And this guy didn't understand how different Cogent was than Allied Riser. We took a network centric approach and targeted buildings. They took a building centric approach and then bought out a building network. So when they were in a duress situation, they actually never filed for bankruptcy. They were doing 3.5 million in monthly recurring revenue with 4.7 million of direct cost of goods sold. So hard to make that one up on volume.
Yeah.
And they had gone through 4 CEOs. So the first CEO was a guy named Todd Dozer. I'll be honest, I've talked to the 2 intermediate ones. I didn't really get much traction with them. And then finally, the CEO that we did a deal with was Jerry Dinsmore, who left GTE as the chief strategy officer after a 30-year career. He actually went to a DSL provider in the Denver area, DSL.net, that
Mm,
blew up.
remember them?
Jerry left and then became the CEO of Allied Riser and concluded that it was not salvageable. Never had met Jerry, didn't know him, and he put out a press release saying he was going to explore strategic options. I literally picked up the phone and said, Jerry, can we meet and talk? And he said, sure, Dave, but I don't fly. I said, okay, I'll come and see you. And I literally hopped on a plane and flew down the next morning on the first flight to Dallas, met him at 1700 Pacific, which was an office tower where their headquarters was. And I quickly realized why Jerry didn't fly. He actually was a chain smoker. And he literally, we conducted the entire negotiations on the sidewalk in August in Dallas outside while he went through 3 packs of cigarettes, one after another. And the reason he didn't fly is he could not be on a plane that long without the nicotine fix.
Ooh, that's not good.
And, but a really nice guy. And he basically was under pressure because he had $140 million of cash on his balance sheet, but $150 million convert outstanding that was a 7.5% coupon due in 5.5 years. And he had a non-functioning business.
Upside down business, or
So
a
what
small
we
business that's burning cash with a shitload of debt and not enough cash to offset it.
so what we did is we ended up creating a new class of super preferred shares. Myself and all of the Cogent preferreds converted to that class. We then created a subordinated class of common that we merged into the Allied Riser public shell, where those shareholders own 13% of the common. But if the preferred converted, they own less than a tenth of 1% of the total shares
Yep.
outstanding. So we ended up merging and we took over the Allied Riser in-building network of 900 in-building risers. We terminated all of the out-of-building agreements, and we then integrated those assets into Cogent. We went Well, first, the convert holders sued us to allege a fraudulent conveyance.
Yep.
Even though the company was not in bankruptcy, they argued the company was in the zone of insolvency.
Yep.
We first went to Delaware
And let me
Chancellor.
just pause, break down what that means. So, uh, one solution that comes to mind from novice people in the distrust is, why don't we just take what's valuable in our business, sell that in a transaction where maybe we're part of the other side of the transaction. Then we could, put a little bit of money as the proceeds from that, and then leave the company that has way too much debt and very little assets. Then it could go bankrupt. So we kind of extracted what was valuable out of the company and benefited from that, and protected those valuable assets from the bankruptcy. Well, of course, that's not legal, or people would always do that to separate what's valuable from what's about to go bankrupt. So when someone tries to do that, they're subject to fraudulent conveyance claims, and so that's what the lawsuit would have been about. They thought they were conveying assets in a fraudulent way so as to leave behind the obligations, but having already stripped out what was valuable. Is that right?
That is exactly right. You're almost an amateur bankruptcy lawyer, Dan.
It's almost like
And
I've done a few deals in my life.
so what happened was we were first sued in Delaware because even though Allied Riser was a Texas-based corporation and was Delaware incorporated, we actually won in the Delaware Chancery Court. The convert holders then took a second bite at the apple and sued us in Dallas for an involuntary bankruptcy. Even though we had 140 million of cash, they said the only purpose of this transaction was to strip the cash out. We had a 2-day trial, testified, had expert witnesses, and showed that we had an industrial need for these in-building infrastructures. And ironically, the bondholders council happened to be a Cogent customer, which was particularly embarrassing to them. It was on the stand that they were telling me I was running a sham business when I pointed out that their internet came from Cogent. Uh, the law firm was Hunt Marsh. Uh, and then from there, the convert holders were still not satisfied and sued a second time in the Supreme Court of Delaware. We had oral arguments in front of the Delaware Supreme Court and
Wow.
actually prevailed. And the day after the Supreme Court ruled in early February, we closed that deal. While that saga was going on, we then did the PSI Net
What,
acquisition.
can I ask you one question before we move
Sure.
on? The Allied Fiber company that had the debt, did the cash kind of go to you guys, and what they got was the cash assets went to you, and they got that slice of equity of common shares in Cogent? And so what they were left with is a tiny bit of Cogent and debt that would be due in a few years.
It was actually a little worse than that, Dan. So what we did is we did what is known as a reverse triangular merger. We became public in name only through that transaction. We then migrated our listing from the NASDAQ to the Amex and suspended all analyst interaction. We then took our existing acquired debt and cross collateralized it by the Allied Riser shareholders, and we dividended the cash out of Allied Riser to the holding company, Cogent. So the convert holders, the day before the deal, were in line to get 140 million of cash as long as they could force a liquidation. And the day after the deal, they, there was no cash to get, and there was actually 500 million of debt sitting ahead of them. And they were not happy campers. Um, we ended up eventually meeting with the three funds that controlled 140 of the 150 of the convert. We ended up buying back that $140 million of convert by giving them 5.1 million in cash and warrants that would have a strike price on an as converted basis in the Cogent. The stock would have to be at 8,900 a share. But needless to say, those warrants expired unexercised. And the funds sold us their position back. We then, in turn, actually sued the Allied Riser board for approving our transaction because they failed to consider a theory of zone of insolvency fiduciary obligation to the convert holders. And we were now standing in the shoes of the convert holders, and we got $10 million from the D&O policy of the Allied Riser insurance. We
Okay.
now pivot over to the next transaction, which was even more complicated, which was the acquisition of PSI Net. The first commercial internet provider, had a football stadium named after it,
In
went
Baltimore?
public, and had a total of 4.3 billion of debt, 300 million of cash on the balance sheet, 9,000 employees, and was administratively insolvent, meaning with no interest or principal payments, they were still burning $10 million a month. There was a
And let me just
11.
pause you first. Let me pause for a second there. So in the book Bandwidth, book I wrote Bandwidth, it starts with kind of the initial internet backbones and focuses on UNet, BBN, and PSI Net. So the PSI Net story, we go into deep dive, the origin story, kind of the glory days of the telecom boom, internet boom, when they got the naming rights to Baltimore Stadium, and then they held out and held out, the crash hit, and then eventually how it ended up in your hands. So the PSI story is pretty well told in
Yeah, Bill Trader, and Bill was actually the head of the computer science lab in the biology department at Cornell, and he co-founded PSI Net with Mitch Levin, who was the head of RPI's computer science lab. And then Mark Fedor was the third person who came in a little bit after and became the CTO of PSI Net. That was the founding team. And
Mhm.
then they eventually had hired Pete Willis from BT to be kind of a hired CEO, and Bill became the chairman. Uh, so PSI Net was in a Mexican standoff between the secured and unsecured creditors. The unsecured creditors were 3.7 billion, and there was 600 million of secured debt. But the secured debt was imperfectly perfected, so they had not filed their UCC ones correctly, and there was a fight because any liquidation would convert the secured to unsecured and split the pie up equally. But the secureds were holding out, thinking they would get the 300 million and the unsecureds would get nothing. So that fight was going on. I ended up going out to PSI Net, which was based in the DC area, meeting with Larry Hyatt, who was the chief restructuring officer, who was put in to kind of unwind PSI Net. I listened to his concerns and then went to the head of the unsecured committee, a guy named Scott Charles, and said, how do we get a deal done? He says, well, as long as I can get a partial recovery out of the 300 million, I will vote to support it. But you got to come up with a mechanism to convert the secureds to unsecured in court. And I said, no problem. I got that. So we ultimately bid 9.9 million in bankruptcy, acquired the entire company. We then
And
had
this
a
is a company that was once worth billions and billions of
that
dollars.
company alone was worth, like, peak market cap was like 14 or 15 billion.
Yes.
And I remember going to a ballroom in Northern Virginia. There were nearly 4,000 employees. They were in the halls everywhere. I was up on a stage. I couldn't even see to the back of the room. And it was an awful feeling. I had to tell all of these people. And then I had people around the country that were, dialed in, that they all lost their jobs. We ended up keeping 53 people out of the 9,000.
Wow.
Well, when we did Allied Riser, there were 971 employees. We made job offers to 2. So uh, we ended up doing PSI Net. And the way we did it was, in the bankruptcy, we went to the court. It was Southern District in New York, Judge Gruber. I testified in front of the judge and I said, look, to salvage this business and create an operating company, there's only one path forward. And I need 3 things. I need an adequate assurance order, which basically said that post petition, I did not have to put any more money in and I could keep running. 2, I would need an abandonment order, which allowed me to convert the secureds to unsecured as long as I abandoned the equipment that they had an adequately perfected UCC1 on. And then third, and maybe most controversial, because PSI Net was all off net, the key backbone in that case was dark fiber that they had gotten from Broadwing.
Yep.
And they also had some lit Quest and Broadwing IRUs. I needed to have a 75-day post-closing transition order that allowed me to sever the contracts and do line-by-line circuit rejection. There was over 20,000 circuits. The records were poor. There was no way pre-closing to unscramble that edge. And the judge gave us those 3 orders,
Wow.
approved the sale, and then what we did is we sent teams of people literally around the country. We removed 36,000 pieces of network equipment and brought them to a central warehouse outside of BWI Airport in Timonium, Maryland. Giant warehouse. It was like 4 acres on the roof. We had 36,000 network devices, either routers, switches, optical transport, every flavor you could think of. And we literally had people going in there 24 hours a day, tagging equipment, secured and unsecured, off of these schedules of things that we got from the bankruptcy estate. And then what we did is, on day 74 of the 75-day order, we sent certified letter to security holders that were exercising our abandonment order. They should pick up their equipment, and there's $600 million of secure claims just became 600 million of unsecured, and the entire unsecured pool grew from 3.7 to 4.3, but then everybody split the 300 million. So the
Right.
unsecureds went from getting nothing to 7 cents on the dollar.
Mm.
And we got PSI Net.
And
And
how did you keep the backbone of PSI Net operational while you were doing that?
we actually took equipment that we had from Organic Cogent and lit a very de minimis backbone that was basically an OC3 with one router per market that was sufficient to keep it alive.
Wow.
So
Wow.
we built a parallel network, and I actually still have the map of the cutover plan where every night we were cutting over segments around the country to migrate your traffic off of PSI Net onto Cogent so we could then affect the abandonment order. So it was a pretty wild action. We then did a couple that we were unsuccessful in, like storage networks that we just failed in. We actually got a second bite at the apple at the Aegis network because after Telia bought it, they then tried to sell it back to us. I had done a call with the head of strategy. His name was Kelly Odell, and ultimately Eva Lindquist, who was the CEO of Telia. And we had cut a deal for them to pay us $32 million to take the asset. We were then again up against Paulo Guidi a second time. He came back and agreed to take it for 16. We matched him, and then he then revised his bid to take only an $8 million subsidy. And they had entered into a very bad IRU with Quest that was just unsustainable. At 8 million subsidy, I called Eva back and just said, I can't do it. You should let Paulo have it. And they acquired the asset. 5 months later, Paulo went bankrupt. It was then bought by a company called Power GlobeNet out of Cincinnati, a voice reseller that was agent-based, private company, still around. A guy named Chris Bradish was the head of strategy there. And he called me up and said, are you going to bid? And I said, no, I'm too busy on other things. Just can't bid this time. They ultimately bought the company for about $8 million out of bankruptcy. I guess the third time, they ended up putting 110 million into it. And then on the fourth go around, they sold it to Cogent for $1. So
Mm.
we ended up with the Net 99 and Aegis assets, but we ended up with them, the fourth go around. We did a couple of small, kind of, I call them tuck-ins. We bought on-site access. We
Yeah.
bought Fiber City, Fiber Network Solutions, UFO, which was unlimited fiber.
Give me a 1 or 2 sentence on each one of those, what those assets were when you bought them.
Okay, so Fiber Network Solutions was a Columbus-based ISP that operated in 3 Midwest markets and was doing about 5 million in revenue,
Yeah.
had a routed network and 3 data centers. Uh, Fiber City was a series of in-building infrastructures like Allied Riser that had actually never become operational.
Mm.
On-site access had raised almost 300 million in private equity, built out a building-centric network, but did have metro network in about 9 or 10 cities.
Gotcha.
And each of these were really, kind of $1 type acquisitions,
Mm.
unopposed. Uh, the next deal of size that we did was the LambdaNet First Mark deal, which was super high profile. That was Michael Price and Lynn Forrester, if you
Okay.
remember that
Yes.
deal. They were going to build a pan-European network
But
that
remind me who Michael Price.
so Michael Price was the head of telecom banking at Lazard,
Oh, yes,
and
of
then
course, yes.
Lynn Forrester was a associate at Pravat. The two of them formed this company, raised $1.1 billion of equity, probably the highest profile telecom deal of all. The board included Henry Kissinger, Burt Roberts, Helmut Kohl, Henry Kravitz, Pat Welsh, Nathan Myhrvold. I mean, this was like the who's who of tech royalty. Baron Evelyn Rothschild was on the board. And the idea was they were going to build a pan-European fixed wireless business across 21 countries with a fiber network to link them together. Business became distressed. Bankruptcy in many of those countries is a criminal offense. Everybody left the board, they resigned, and eventually this poor guy who was just at the time an associate at Wells Carson was the only guy left as the sole director. He was like 25 years old. His name was John Clark. He since had a very successful career, and he was told to unwind this thing. They had hired PwC. They brought in an external management team from Motorola to try to run it. A guy named Bernie Smedley was the CEO. Uh, Jaime Martel was the guy running Spain. Dieter Finke was running Germany. And actually, the guy running France still works for Cogent, Vincent Tessier. And they had pared the market back. Lynn turned out to get the best deal of all. She ended up marrying Baron Rothschild and is
Oh,
now
there you go.
Baron Rothschild.
So she had her exit strategy all set.
The Baron passed away last year. She's 61 and he was 86 when she passed away, but he passed away. And Lynn is very well taken care of. I'll just leave it at that. And it was one of the most surreal things. In the grand opening, the company was never operational. They actually had a live simulcast with Bill Clinton in the Oval Office wishing them good luck and thanking them for building this pan-European network. And it was just unreal. They had simultaneous symphony concerts to commemorate the linkage of the cities with the Berlin Philharmonic, the Paris Philharmonic, and the London Philharmonic. And you had all these guys like Henry Kissinger and Helmut Kohl in the audience clapping. It was just unreal. So we acquired the companies. We acquired the holding company in Luxembourg. The three operating companies each had their own challenges. So in Spain, there was 168 million of debt to the railroad authority
Yep.
because the majority of their fiber was along the railroad. We negotiated with Renfe, the rail authority. We converted that into a $5 million non-interest bearing note that would be payable on an IPO, which they eventually got their $5 million and exited. We ended up in France negotiating with Louis Dreyfus, who had an $88 million loan for fiber along the French canal system. And we converted that into a two-tier note for about $7 million. that they were then paid off over 6 years with no interest. And then the final piece was the German piece based in Hanover. And there was a loan for about 40 million euros from KfW, which was the German development bank owned by the German government. They refused to transfer. We ended up putting the German entity into bankruptcy, which is called administration in Germany. It was going to be liquidated, and then the banks paid us 200,000 to take it out of administration and transfer it to them, which was fine. So we ended up with a pan-European network with a hole in the middle of it in Germany. At that point, we ended up acquiring Global Access, which was originally SurfNet of Europe,
Yep.
that was owned by the U.S. defense contractor General Atomics, Neil Blue.
Mm.
And they had a pan-German network with an extensive fiber network, and it was burning cash. They exchanged their equity interest for some warrants in Cogent that ultimately turned into a few thousand shares. And we ended up substituting the SurfNet network in Germany for the original FirstMark network. And then we own the Holdco network, which was the LambdaNet network based in Luxembourg. And we ended up preserving 1.1 billion of Luxembourg NOLs out of that transaction, which we still have on our balance sheet. We did a couple of more small deals. We bought Carrier One in the Netherlands and Benelux, Belgium, Luxembourg out of bankruptcy, integrated those assets. That was a Providence Equity Partners deal that had a failed IPO, was building a pan-European network. And then probably the last sizable deal we did was we acquired Vario from NTT.
Oh yeah. Yep.
So again, another centennial deal. It was based in Denver. It was a roll-up of 61 regional ISPs.
Right.
Justin Joshby was the CEO, had taken the company public. It was then by DLJ was the underwriter, no debt. The company was sold for 5.4 billion and a take private
Yep.
to NTT.
Hmm.
Everybody exited. NTT bought the business for 5.4 billion, invested 1.7 billion modernizing the network, and then sold it to us for $1. As they were hemorrhaging cash. There
Yep.
were 1,803 employees. And I remember talking to Suzuki-san, the chairman of NTT, and he said, I do not want the headline to be Japanese multinational fires 1,800 Americans. I said, I'll take that headline. I don't,
Yes. How about it?
And we ended up buying it. We gave jobs to 13 of the 1,803. Actually, 3 or 4 of them are still at Cogent. I talked to one of them today, and we integrated those assets. That was the last major acquisition that then allowed. There were some smaller ones like
Yep.
PSI Net, which was some data centers in the Midwest. But, that was the last one of substance. And basically, 7 months after doing that transaction, we had no cash left.
And when was where were we in the timeline? So Vario happened when, and roughly what year?
Burial happened in December of '04.
Okay, so you got all this done in like a 3-year period during the depth of the meltdown.
Oh,
In
yeah.
fact, 2004 is when we did ICG. So while we were doing getting into it with buying ICG for pennies on the dollar, you had already done a shitload of stuff. I don't know what I was doing those 3 years, but I should have been doing what you were doing.
And then what we did was realize that we had a great network. We served 9 European and the US and Canada because we actually bought STOC in Canada, which is where we competed a little bit with you with Allstream. We had actually looked at Allstream twice, once before Manitoba bought it and once after, and didn't get a deal done either time. Dean Prevost was the CEO, who was someone who probably crossed your path because
I don't know.
he was at Allstream under Pierre when MTS owned it.
Yeah, that might have been right before us because Mike Stropel was running it when we
And
bought it.
Mike worked for Dean.
Yeah, so Mike proved to be a great partner for a lot of years. I mean, he was at Zayo after I left Zayo. Mike was a rock star.
But, we ended up having roughly 60 million in revs, 0 EBITDA, and we needed to hire a sales force, and we had a public shell. First quarter, we went EBITDA neutral. Lehman did what was technically a follow-on, but it was really our IPO. We did over 100 investor meetings over a 2.5-week period, and we did something very unusual. We went out with a prospectus with no price on the cover. And the reason is the public stub was being day traded. The stock ran up to $28.30. We ended up pricing the deal at $6. It was actually the largest discount for a follow-on offering on a major exchange in U.S. history.
Wow.
But it was really our first access to the public markets. We raised $69 million of primary proceeds. We created a vehicle to allow the 10 funds to exit. They exited at an average of 2.3x their return, and it allowed me to begin to start to rebuild my position in Cogent. And it finally allowed us to hire a sales force. And then for the next roughly 18 years, we didn't do a single transaction. We looked at over 825 and just organically grew at 10.2% year over year with an average of 220 basis points a year of margin expansion.
Yep. And then you fast forward 18 years, you did a really big acquisition of the Sprint network. Is that right?
That is correct, Dan. And we actually have looked at Sprint twice previously. So the first time we looked at Sprint, I actually was contacted by Joe Utenauer, the CFO of
As
Sprint.
was I at that same time.
And he basically said, I don't think Mazda has an interest in this business. I
Yeah.
thought of you, Dave. I hopped on a plane, first flew out, met with Joe, Michael Schwartz, who was running strategy, Steve Elfman, and Dan Hesse, who was CEO. And I had known Dan from his Astro Terra days and from his Lucent days. And, we met, we chatted, and they basically said, we're fine. We're a wireless company. Go talk to Mazda. So I flew out and met with Mazda in San Mateo. Had a very good meeting.
Yep. Met with him
We
out there
then
once myself.
grass mats, had sushi for breakfast. Only
Oh,
time in my
he
life.
didn't give me sushi for breakfast. I got to sit there with all of his people in the room and me, my CFO, and 40 of them.
Literally, it was me and him and geishas serving us on grass mats for 3 hours.
Oh, what did I
And
do wrong?
it's the only time in my life I've had eggs and sushi on the same plate. But anyhow, from that, the second stop was I had to go see Ron Fisher in
Yeah.
Boston, who
Yep.
ran
Spent time with Ron.
North America. Very thoughtful guy, South
Yeah.
African, Orthodox Jewish guy, really good guy. Met with him, got the thumbs up. Then I flew to Tokyo for my third piece and negotiated a second time with Masa and Ken, and I can't pronounce his last name, who ran SoftBank Japan. And there must have been 40 guys in that row, all nodding their head with translators talking in their ears.
Yep.
And I don't think anybody other than Masa spoke English. And Masa and I shook hands on a deal. And I get ready to leave the meeting. And he says, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to the airport." He said, "No, you're not. You're going to stay here and we're going to announce the deal tomorrow." I said, "I can't do that. I've done no serious due diligence and I have no board approval and I'm a public company." And he literally looks up at me. He's a really small guy. And he says, "Real entrepreneurs don't worry about things like that." I didn't know what to say to the guy other than, "Thank you. Talk to you later."
Yeah.
I flew back. I held a board meeting. I took a team out. We spent a week in KC. And then Masa just flaked out, disappeared, just lost interest in doing a deal. Fast forward to 2019, SoftBank sells its position in Sprint, which was 85.5%, to T-Mobile.
Yep.
Peter Ewings runs strategy, hires TAP advisors, Davis Terry, to run a process. Sends me a book, probably sent you a book,
Yes.
looked at it, and I bid 0 because that's what it was worth. And Peter rejected my bid and everybody else's bid, probably yours as well. And
We
then,
didn't even bid.
okay, there were other bids, but nobody did a deal. Peter then hired a consultant, paid them, put $10 million into the business trying to restructure it, gave up, hired a second consultant to shut it down, began the shutdown process. They were in the process of spending $1.5 billion shutting business down. They hired a second banker. You probably know him, Chris Wilson of Houlihan Lokey.
Yes.
Actually, I crossed paths with Chris 20 years earlier because he was the junior guy on the Allied Riser deal, and he had poorly written his engagement letter and he got no fee. And I was called every name under the sun for doing a deal and not paying him. So he literally calls me up, and I had to think for a minute when I picked up the phone. He says, "Chris Wilson," it came back. I said, "You're not calling me about the fee after 20 years." Ruth laughed. He said, "No, you got to bid on Sprint." I said, "I'm not bidding because I've wasted my time twice before." They said, "This time's different. They really do want to transact. They're serious and they're going to write a check." I said, "How bad is it?" He says, "It's bad." And at that
Yeah,
point,
I remember that was that was their value prop on why we should spend time on it, because it was really bad. Like, well,
right. And I said, "Okay, I'll dig in and do the work." Went to Seattle, went back to Kansas City, went to the office in Northern Virginia, worked with Peter, with Greg O'Connor, who was running the division and the management team. And we structured a deal that really had 3 pieces. One, they would spend $500 million pre-closing doing restructuring. 2, they would sell us the operating business and give us $700 million of cash over a 54-month period. And we could restructure that business, but we had to honor contracts. And then third, we would get to buy the physical network that they had built at a capital cost of $20,500,000,000. It was 19,000 route miles of owned fiber, long haul, 1,200 route miles of metropolitan fiber owned, and 482 fee simple owned buildings for $1. But that network was dormant. It really wasn't coupled to the operation of the business, and it was burning cash. We consummated that deal. We have stripped the costs out. We've shrunk the acquired Sprint business to a break-even business, and we have now repurposed the Sprint network by interconnecting it with our metro footprint. And now we're selling wavelengths across 938 data centers across North America at either 10, 100, or 400 gigs with a wave optimized network. And Dan, we've been getting time signals multiple times already.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. I know we were going to shoot for an hour and 15 minutes. Those time signals are for us. Do you want to go a little bit further and just bring us up to date on Cogent now? So you've had that for a year or two.
Listen, I might be the first guy to do part 3. I unfortunately have some other commitments I got to work on, but hopefully this brought people up through the Sprint transaction. This was very much the Cliff Notes version of these deals. They were hairy, complicated, and I had never done restructuring in my life, and this was like learn on the fly.
Yes, no, it's quite the journey. I couldn't even do Cogent in bandwidth because I would have to make it another quarter size bigger, and what you were doing isn't well published in the press. So I could not have pieced together a story, but who knows? Maybe I'll take this and use this to put together kind of another chapter of bandwidth that is the Cogent story. But hey, I appreciate the time again. I know there's a lot of people listening to us who are getting enormous business value out of this, and a few of us who are getting some good entertainment value out of it as well, because it really tells a story of what it's like to be in a boom and then a massive meltdown, and then kind of a creative entrepreneur like you, extraordinarily intelligent person like you, who can able to see through all of this kind of mess and see an opportunity and navigate through and create something really special. So congratulations, and thank you for sharing the story.
Hey, thanks, Dan. And generally, we are press averse. That's probably why you didn't know much about us. Cogent never put out press releases except when we had to.
Yes.
And I'm a strong believer in keep your head down and do your job. Take care, all. Stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe on your listening platform. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Kendall Weinberg with support from Gibson Siegert.